I want to bring in my guests. I am joined with the man himself, the one, the only, Michael Maloof. Great friend of the show. There we are. Great friend of the show. Michael, let me give you your byline. Michael Maloof. He is There we are. Michael Maloof. He is former senior security policy analyst for the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service experience in the U.S. Department of Defense. How you doing this morning? You doing okay?
I'm hanging in there.
Good. I got to get your take, just your overall view of what has been taking place over the last, I guess, few days. It's been about 2 weeks. Trump had his phone call with Putin last week. They moved extremely fast to have talks in Riyadh. Those talks broke up yesterday with Rubio coming out effectively saying, hey, we have a great opportunity here in order to kind of put this to bed. The conversation seems to be not just on Ukraine, but on global affairs in its entirety, and the normalization of relationship with Russia. Give me your take, just your overall view as we step into this.
Well, I think you're seeing a whole new paradigm occurring here uh, toward Europe. The the outlook on the whole geopolitical, geostrategic frameworks that have existed for so long. Uh, the questioning of whether NATO is really a viable um, defense alliance in this day and age when we don't see any when Russia actually was provoked. I in the first place with as a result of the West. And I just heard a little commentary this morning where someone was saying that Trump was all wrong about uh, suggesting that Zelensky had, the so-called president of Ukraine, had uh, could have ended this conflict, but didn't. They question that when they say, "Well, Russia invaded." Well, that's true. Russia did invade, but nobody talks about the history that led up to that occurrence. These things just don't happen in a vacuum. It was 10 years of 8 years of bombing relentlessly the eastern part of Ukraine, and the fact that of NATO expansion, which the Russian Federation felt became a threat when its own defense alliance, the Warsaw Pact, had gone away back in 1991. So and you have people openly in the West, Boris Johnson, Victoria Nuland, openly advocating for the overthrow of Putin and his government, and maybe even breaking up Russia as a result. So they were pretty open about it, and Victoria Nuland actually has admitted that they told Zelensky not to sign the Minsk One, Minsk Two actually agreements,
Mhm.
and even though the respective size of Russia and Ukraine had already initialed. So there's a lot more history that needs to come out that most people are not aware of. And if you put it all into context, and that's key, you just don't take a little snippet and run with it and say, "Aha! I found the silver bullet." No, you got to put it all together and look at it in its totality to understand the complexity of this situation that evolved over a decade. So
You
I think we're
pointed
going to see a whole new paradigm here. That's my point. We're going to hold. Trump has said enough wars, and this should never have happened. And what he's doing is really reestablishing what I believe are new spheres of influence, to reintroduce that concept where we don't meddle in European affairs and the Eurasian affairs if they don't if those other countries in the world don't come into our area of influence. And that's why
right.
I think you're seeing him focus more on the areas of Greenland, uh, Canada, Panama Canal, etc.
You pointed out in one of your, I guess, commentaries on this, that this is the end of NATO. That Trump effectively is saying we're dealing with American interests. We are not going to be involved in another European war. I mean, for God's sake, Europe started 2 wars. It seems like they were edging and pushing for a third. We're out of it. We're done. And if you try to intrude and involve yourself into the peace agreements, we will, I guess, use the hammer of pulling out troops, or for that matter, we will not be a backstop to NATO going forward. And even the 5% thing on some level leads into that, effectively saying you need to pay now 5% for your militaries going forward, something that they couldn't even do 2%, let alone 5.
No,
Why
that's
do you
right.
think the end, this is the end of NATO? That's the way you put it.
I think it's the beginning of the end of NATO. I think it could bust up into regional defense alliances. The Scandinavian countries have theirs, and Eastern Europeans have theirs. But as a cohesive entity, that the NATO and the EU, as far as I can see, really have outlived their usefulness and effectiveness, and because they have begun to try to usurp the nationalistic notions of each country. That's why you're seeing Hungary, Slovenia, these countries beginning to recoil, and of course that ever present recalcitrant Turkey. You can't figure one day or the next which leaning he's on, that Erdogan's on. So it's a real complex balancing act, and you won't find cohesiveness if the United States chose not to participate in NATO. Europe itself would not be able to manage its own defenses collectively, and they have proven that. And I think they're beginning to admit it.
I want to play this clip, and I want to get your take on this clip where Donald Trump is talking about, look, you guys have 3 years to negotiate an end to this war, and you didn't take it. And I say, yeah, he's right. This is Trump.
Do you have any message for Ukrainians who, after 3 years of fighting, might feel betrayed or disappointed at not having a seat at these initial talks in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think I'm really disappointed in what's happened. I've been watching this for 3 years. It's a war that would have never happened if I was president, and I've been watching these people being killed at levels that you've rarely seen, not even close, since the Second World War. And I'm very disappointed. I hear that they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years, and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago, without the loss of much land, very little land, without the loss of any lives, and without the loss of cities that are just laying on their sides. You have those magnificent golden domes that are shattered, will never be replaced. You can't replace them. 1,000-year-old domes that are so beautiful, you can't replace that. The whole civilization has changed because of what. So when they're worried about not being seated, you mean somebody that should have gone in and made a deal a long time ago.
What are your thoughts on this idea that this is somehow a betrayal, that Donald Trump ending the war is somehow betraying Ukraine because they're not at the bargaining table as this
this is what I was referring to at the outset. You're getting this kind of throwback, and it's not accurate. Look, in 2015, there was an opportunity to sign the Minsk II. It was to remedy what was seen as inequities between the east and the western parts of Ukraine. The eastern parts, which is predominantly Russian speaking, wanted autonomy, and they never agreed to the notion of the not only the 2014 coup, but also the reason for the coup, which was that the West, Yanukovych, who was then the legitimate president of Ukraine, refused to sign on to the EU at that time. He wanted to join instead the Eurasian Economic Union run by Russia, and you had Victoria Nuland and then Vice President Biden staged this coup in 2014 that resulted in Yanukovych having to escape with his life to Moscow. That's where he is today. So there's a history here that no one wants to talk about. In addition, and this is very serious, there's always been the talk of indivisibility. That is, you don't arm the West at the expense of the East. And there were agreements to that effect, to which both the East and the West agreed, including the United States. They include the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, the 1990 Charter of Paris for New Europe, which was the creation of OSCE, the 1997 Founding Act on Mutual Relations, Cooperation and Security, the Istanbul Proposal of 1999. And then in 1991, there was a document found, coincidentally, in one of the archives in Britain that pointed to an agreement on no NATO expansion and the promise of a former and promises made by former U.S. presidents and a Secretary of State, namely James Baker. So, and this was in 1991. And then you had the Ankara Agreement of 2010. All of these agreements pledged no arming of the West at the expense of the East. If that meant no NATO expansion. Every one of those agreements were violated, and Russia kept warning the West of these activities. And I might add that when Ukraine became a country after the fall of the Soviet Union, they signed a non-alignment agreement called the 1990 Declaration on State Sovereignty of Ukraine. It was signed on 16 July 1990, went into effect. And it basically said that Ukraine would remain non-aligned. That meant no joining East or West alliances. Well, the Warsaw Pact had already gone away, but NATO continued. And in fact, up until the time of the SMO, the Special Military Operation in February of 2022, people were wondering, scratching their heads, well, what's NATO going to be doing? I mean, they're not they don't really have a job. Should we manage the Arctic? Should we manage space? Should we oversee the Far East? I mean, they were groping under Stoltenberg. They were groping for a mission. So, and then the SMO did give them a whole new lease on life, and that's what then brought in Sweden and Finland and into NATO. So it's this history it was provoked. It was provoked over a decade period of time, and nowhere in the West you hear anybody talk about this. They just think one morning Putin woke up and decided to invade Ukraine. No, it didn't happen that way. I just wanted to put that on the record.
There we are. I was having a bit of mic issues. I'm sorry. No, Mike.
I thought you were speechless.
No, my mic just died. It's just your mic is no longer connected. It's like, okay, what is going on with my mic? No, you're absolutely right. That is something that is always left out of the conversation and the dialogue. And I think that's why unprovoked war of aggression was so aggravating to me every time I would hear it. Unprovoked. It was literally provoked. They were literally trying to put NATO on the border of Russia, and to do so by overthrowing the government of Ukraine to do it. And then they were acting like completely unprovoked. It just happened. Putin just woke up that day and just decided he wanted to invade. No, there's nothing else to it. There's don't look further into it. Just take our lying words as reality. No, you're absolutely right. I guess
the problem is that the West, because of our consumption of news, we only live by sound bites. We don't get the contextual meaning of what was being done and said. And this is the fault of people who listen to the news. They don't bother to go out and get the story and understand how answer the fundamentals: who, what, when, where, why, and how. They don't do that. They just accept what they hear and they move on, and then that's what they hang on to as gospel, and it's not true.
Well, Russia has clearly delineated their red lines. They point out, coming out of both, that they heard
Yes.
for the first time. Lavrov and his team was like, the U.S. heard us, not just
Yes.
in an esoteric sense, but they seem to take our concerns in a real sense far more than they've ever had before. So that's great. I guess the question is going to be, what is Putin going to have to give in order to get this deal? Meaning, because Donald Trump is going to need something as a face-saving mechanism. They're already screaming, "Oh my God, this is a betrayal." So he's going to have to go out with something saying, "This is what I got out of this." What is that thing going to be that you think Trump is going to get in order to make this deal work?
I think it's going to be more on a strategic level. I don't think it's going to be relegated just to Ukraine per se. I think he's probably in exchange. I think he's probably going to basically begin the decoupling of NATO, because they still want war, and we hear them even now, this minute. They want to send in troops into Ukraine.
Here's Starmer and Macron. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Does the United States want to continue fighting European wars? We've fought 2 of them. I mean, we're fighting wars that are based upon centuries-old feuds. Centuries.
Yeah.
We were warned by George Washington. We got to take this seriously. Don't get involved in foreign entanglements. And man, are we into it deeply. And we don't heed the words.
I guess my thing, though, is Trump is going to have to get something out of it. Meaning, if Russia is saying, look, these territories are ours, there's no NATO expansion, meaning if that's what Russia wants, and if Trump gives that, because that's what Trump is going to have to give. I mean, there's no leeway in regards to this NATO expanding into Ukraine. That's off the table. Trump has said it's off the table. Trump has even went further, making this argument. Look, Russia would never tolerate Ukraine going into NATO, even before Putin. And went further in saying this is not something that we want when it resumes in 6 months, meaning we need a permanent settlement to the war going forward and on what the world looks like in regards to European security architecture.
Well, I'll tell you something. It's my suggestion that Trump is looking at the U.S. having a final settlement. He cannot control what the Europeans do. They're the ones who are yakking away about wanting to send in troops and what have you. He's saying, I've done my bit. I'm out of here. That's my impression. This is my impression. And he's going to he's talking to an equally strong strategic partner. Russia probably has the strongest army in the world today, outside of China probably, but in the West. And frankly, he has other priorities. He has other agenda items as priorities. And having these wars that never seem to get resolved are something that he's not in favor of. He's a guy who likes to he's decisive. He's a can-do guy, and he wants to see a beginning, middle, and end. And he's not seeing it with this prolongation of this conflict. And I might add that no one talks about it once again, but Putin warned back in December of 2021. He warned in a series of demarches to diplomatic notes to the State Department of the crisis that we were having, that was brewing if they continued with NATO expansion, and they were talked down to. They were poo-pooed. They were saying, "Well, we'll see what we can do." They treated it as though it was just a very brazenly and basically dismissed it. And we saw the consequences.
I'm curious,
2022.
From your take on this, where do you think this goes? I mean, are you hopeful about it? And I've asked this question to pretty much everybody on this issue because I'm curious on their takes. Do you see this as being legitimate move to end it? Do you think he's making the moves to end it? And why do you think he's doing this? Meaning, I don't get the sense that he's doing this for the love of Russia. it's for something else. What do you think the rationale that Trump is going with in order to end this conflict? Like, why do you think he is doing this as opposed to, let's say, another Republican or another Democrat in regards to ending these wars? What is Trump seeing that many of these other people aren't, that is pushing him to do this?
There may be in the back of his mind the notion of using Russia as a wedge to drive a wedge, I should say, between Russia and China. Ultimately, I don't think that's going to happen in the near term. I just don't see that. And the way he's attacking BRICS, I think he's trying to dampen the enthusiasm by the other countries, and of course BRICS is a Russian Chinese invention, and as an alternative to Western institutions and financial institutions. So I think there is in fact a further purpose behind his wanting to deal with Russia. Russia, of course, is very strong. They have more nuclear weapons than we do. China has a low third, but certainly Russia is a major challenge. Plus, it's a challenge not only Europe, but because the reality is they have the hypersonics that can reach us, and we have no defense. So it's important that he opens up dialogue and stays in, and works with the Russians. And also there are areas where even the Russians have said, look, there are areas where we can cooperate. No one knows this, or maybe a few do, but Russia was very much involved in the founding of the United States. It was Catherine the Great who blocked the UK failed to honor the UK blockade of the colonies, and the same again during the Civil War, failed to honor the blockade, the British blockade of the North. So it's in fact the Russians like to take credit for helping the United States become the United States, and we're treating them like crap. There's a long history. They sold us Alaska, remember?
They did. They did.
So no one knows this history. People need to go back and understand what that history is. And I'm sure that when Trump and Putin sit down together, Putin's going to give him a nice, tidy historical lecture on the history of Russian-U.S. relations.
What do you think well, speaking of that, what do you think of that conversation is going to be between these two? I mean, they're talking about meeting. Some people said a week. It's probably going to be more than a week, but that meeting is.
You mean a week from now?
Yeah, but it's probably going to be more than that. But people are saying that meeting is definitely going to take place. What do you think that conversation is going to be about? Like, what do you think they're going to talk about in that meeting? Like I said, Ukraine is a chip on the table. It's not the entirety of the conversation.
Right,
but
it's not.
What's the thrust of that conversation? What do you think the outcome of that conversation is going to be?
Well, first of all, I think it's going to happen maybe toward the latter part of this month at the earliest, because the teams have to get together and come up with the agenda, come up with the issues they want to discuss. I think it's going to be a myriad of strategic issues, maybe working out deals in terms of the northern passageway in the Arctic, for one. That's one possibility. In fact, the Russians suggested that they could actually work together on something like that. Mm-hmm. I think they're going to be working on what constitutes spheres of influence, and with more emphasis on Trump dealing with strategic partners as opposed to the Europeans who are basically decimated for all intents and purposes. They don't be, and the Brits are the ones who have this eternal history of hatred toward Russia, and it's historic, and this is why you see this antagonism to this day between Russia and the UK. They can also talk about going back and re-examining the whole issue of intermediate range ballistic missiles. Mm-hmm. They could talk about trying to cut nuclear weapons stockpiles in half, maybe down to next to nothing if possible. I remember when I was working with under Richard Pearl in the Pentagon. He actually got Reagan to suggest to Gorbachev that they cut nuclear weapons to zero. And
Wow.
there was talk about that. I don't see why we can't do that again. And that followed after the fall of the wall, I believe, in Berlin. So I think out of these long stalemated crises, something else can emerge out of it that can be hopeful and fruitful. And I'm hoping that we can begin to do this. Plus, we still have the terrorism threats that are underway, and the Russians can really help us on something like that. But we need to. The Russians want to be, as I understand it, want to be treated as an equal. They don't want to be talked down to. They look upon themselves as an equal strategic partner, and they have a very formidable nuclear fleet today, nuclear submarine fleet that probably could outpace ours, and so their triad is, even though their air and ballistic missile portions of the triad are potentially vulnerable, the submarines are not, and also now they have hypersonics. We don't even have a defense against them. So there's a lot we need to work on, and the same would go with China. We need to bring all on. I think if we're going to do a bilat with the Russians on for an intermediate range ballistic missile, we're going to have to start including other countries, China, Iran. I mean, we got to open up to Iran and to get them into this. We need to lessen the tensions in the world and try to bring back the threat notion that exists right now, because it's pretty bad, and any conflict could just be the proverbial spark that lights it all.
When you were in office, what were the relationships between Russia and the U.S.? I mean, were there back channel communications? How did those communications typically work?
Yeah, there were back channels. It was a Cold War when I began.
Yeah.
And the whole notion, of course, was to basically bring them to their knees economically, even though they had lost. I could see that. Even though the Cold War was supposed to allegedly be over, we began to treat them as though they were serfs. They were second rate. I led one of the first teams into Moscow after the fall of the Soviet Union back in 1991.
Yeah.
And everything was bleak. It was very bleak. No lights, no people hardly on the streets. And then I go back in 2017 and again last year. Man, it's a whole different world. It's lively, and I'm asking myself, where are the sanctions? I mean, you see cars from all over the world driving around, young people out, lights everywhere, very flourishing. I mean, it's a totally different picture today than it was back in 91. So Russia has really improved economically over time, in spite of the sanctions, I might add, which has made them, in one sense, very much stronger and self-reliant, and that's what they like to brag upon. So do the Iranians. The sanctions, even though they're supposed to punish and make them heel to our demands, it actually emboldens them and challenges them to come up and be their own self-reliant countries, and they're doing a great job of it. It may not have the qualitative edge that we have, but certainly it's functionally equivalent.
Before I let you go, hit Iran for a bit. I've seen some reports that have stated that Trump wants Russia to help with Iran, that effectively it's almost like Russia is a back channel to Iran. How do you see that? Do you see that as being also part of the conversation?
Yes, I do. And I think that that's an important point. because of that closeness, because they have virtually a strategic relationship between each other now.
Right.
I think Trump recognizes that. We got to look at what the reality is that's facing us today. It's totally unlike what it was when he was in office the first time. Biden did a great job of screwing up the world through his lack of leadership and incompetence, and now this is the mess that Trump has to deal with, and he doesn't. Why would he want to go and bomb Iran when he's trying to stop these wars? He doesn't want another war. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So work with the Iranians, and I may have said to you at one point that he's used Musk to talk to the Iranians. Musk I'm told, has a biological father who was Iranian. And I think that he's using that entree to talk to the Iranians, and they have indicated, they have sent diplomatic signals back that they're willing to work with the United States. I think we can, and I think where it's going to revolve around is that the United States, Russia will work with Iran to work on their nuclear program. They have a legitimate right and need for nuclear reactors. Just don't make a bomb. That's the only criteria. That can be managed if it's done properly, and but there's got to be not only confidence building, but building of trust. And right now, both with the Russians and with the Iranians, that trust is really almost non-existent. And that's what why this Riyadh meeting was so important, was to rebuild trust, the beginning of trust and confidence building, that they can work together and have a positive exchange of views and make decisions based upon those. And you don't need the meddling of Europeans. They're so antagonistic. All they want to do is continue war. Well, that they're part of the problem, not part of the solution. So Trump has moved on.
Last question before I let you go. Does Europe have any capability of interrupting the peace process? What they can do is independently act. The United States will not come to their assistance, and if they want to antagonize the Russians, then it's on them, and it will not involve NATO. And if they want to go ahead and attempt to attack Russia, then the Russians are just going to sweep in, and Article 5 just will not apply. And I can assure you that all of the NATO countries combined would have a very difficult time without the United States to take on the Russians at this point. They don't have the firepower. They don't have the industrial base. They don't have the ability to continue industrial production of war equipment, because then their industries will be vulnerable to hypersonics. Michael Maloof, he is former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, regular contributing analyst for RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service experience in the office or the U.S. Department of Defense. Michael, man, always appreciate these conversations. Thank you for this.
Thank you.